Hello guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to solder the components onto the PCB we designed. Here you can see our completed PCB populated with all the components, and if it is showing up in the video you can see that the LEDs are in fact blinking. If I give it a little bit of shade here, they blink. Now I'm going to turn them off by taking out the coin cell battery, and I'll show you how it should look in the end. We've got our resistors up here and here. We've got our transistors, our capacitors, and then our battery bracket. And then on the front, we've got our LEDs. I can zoom in a little bit to show you guys that here. So we've got our LEDs and the resistors, the transistors, and the capacitors. So I'm going to put this down to the side, and I'm going to kind of guide you guys through the tools that we're going to be using. So first of all, we're going to need our blank PCB. That is a given. And then with that, we will want to sort out all of our components. Oh, I just spilled them. It's all good. Just pick them up just like that. So I'm going to drag these on over. We've got our components here laid out. I've got all the resistors, the capacitors, the transistors, all the LEDs, and our battery bracket here laid out on this piece of paper. And then to the side of me I've got a picture of the schematic diagram so that I could use it as a guide. Now the tools, we're going to want to use tweezers. We're going to want solder. So I've got a spool of solder here to the side. And then we're going to need our soldering iron, which is this tool here. And in some cases we're going to want to use some solder flux, as well as possibly some solder paste when soldering on the battery bracket. Okay, so now we're going to start by soldering on the resistors. So on the back here, you can see each of the resistor pads labeled with the R reference designator. So we've got R1, R4, R8, R7, all the way up to R10. Now keep in mind the direction in which the silkscreen lines between the pads are going. In this case, the silkscreen lines are going in a horizontal direction for these resistors, and then these two resistors here are going in a vertical direction. So always make sure to note which direction those are going so that you don't solder them on in the wrong direction. And it is also the same for the capacitors as well. So now I'm going to start by soldering the resistors on. I'm going to grab my tweezers. Make sure to have those handy. Now, the strategy I like to use is I will solder on one pad. So I'll start up here at the top right corner. This top pad here I'm going to put solder on. Get a bit of solder, but I'm going to leave the other pad empty. I won't have solder on that, I'll just have solder on this pad here. The reason being, we're going to solder on the resistor one pad at a time. So I'm going to hold the resistor here, the component, as you can see in my tweezers. I'm going to hold it down, and I'm just going to get the solder to flow on both of them to make sure it lays flat. And now that I've got that, I can go in again and I can put solder on the other pad to finalize the component here. See, now it is completely soldered on, and I'll touch up the previous pad here, and just like that we've got our first component soldered on. Now I'm going to whiz through some of the other ones. All of the resistors are lined up the same way, so I'm just going to put solder on one pad for each component. I'll do the top here first. And then I'll grab the resistors that I want to use, and I'll just hold them in my tweezers and solder them down. Just like this. Just like that. You can see they're They're held down very nicely. Clean solder joints. Now make sure to heat up both the pad and the component. That way the solder flows to both the pad and the component. You can think of it as low temperature welding or brazing. Just like that. And now I'm going to put solder on the other pads. Putting the iron in between both the pad and the component, I'm going to slowly feed solder in between. We don't need much solder, note, just enough to get the pad to connect to the component. And just like that, you can give them a little bit of a touch-up, quick taps with the iron to make sure the solder flows correctly. And make sure a good connection has been made. And just like that, we have our resistors on. Now I'm going to quickly rush through the other 6 resistors here, and I'll be back in just a sec. Now I'm going to do the vertical aligned resistors here, the 22 kilo ohm resistors. And make sure, I forgot to note, make sure that the black face of the resistor is facing you so that people can read the numbers displayed on the resistor. So I'm just going to tack these down here and solder them up. See how this is upside down? I want to flip it over and then put it on. Nice clean connection, just like that. Okay, and that concludes the resistors. Now in some cases you will want to use flux. Here I've got some set to the side, and I'm just going to go through and put some flux onto some of these pads to touch them up. I'm just going to use a through-hole resistor to do that. Anything that can spread the flux, really. I'm just going to put it on the pads to make sure that I can get the solder to flow nicely. This will just ensure that each connection that we made is a solid, strong one. And then I'm just going to go over with the soldering iron and touch each joint up. Make sure all the solder flowed, and just like that I knocked a component out of place. Can't be too quick with these. There we go. Get him back in place. and then touch up these guys. Make sure there's enough solder. And very nice. Each joint is clean. Just like that. Alright, and now let's try our soldering skills on with the capacitors. So I'll be doing the capacitors here, and these are lined up, as you can see, in these silk screen lines, horizontal and vertical. So we'll start by putting solder on one of the two pads we're provided for each. So just like that, same method as the capacitors. I put solder on one of the two pads, so I left solder off of one pad. And same with this guy, so that we can line it up, tack it down, and then put solder on the second pad. And I will add just a bit of flux to each to make it nice and clean right off the bat. Just like that. Give it a small amount of flux, and then I'll grab the capacitors and I'll solder them down. So just like this, I'm going to rotate the board and make it so I can solder this on easily. Get a little bit of solder on the component, make sure it holds down. I'll do the same on this side. I'll just put it down, give it a little bit of push, and just like that, there. Down. Now we can go and we can add solder to the other side. And touching up the first joint, making sure that it's a good connection. Just like that, we have our capacitors soldered down, as you can see here. So now that we've got all of our passive components soldered down, I'm going to solder on the transistors. Now with the transistors, I do recommend you use a little bit of flux. This will just make sure that all the solder connections are clean and strong. So I just put a little bit of flux on there. I'm going to put a bit of solder on one of the three pads that we're given. As you can see, we've got 3 pads. I'm going to put solder on this pad here and this pad here, just so that I can hold down the transistor and put solder on the other 2 pads afterwards. So I'm going to put a bit of solder on there, a bit of solder on there. We don't need too much, just enough that the pad has solder and can get a good hold. Just like that. And now we're going to grab our transistor. Now note, being that transistors are 3-legged devices, they have an orientation. Luckily, it would be very impressive if you were to solder this on backwards, because both the legs and the body have an odd shape that indicate which way is down. The legs will be bent towards the bottom so that they can make a strong connection to the pads. So I'm just going to place it down, tack on the one pin, make sure it's lined up nicely so that all the other pads can make a good connection as well, just like that. And now I'm going to add solder to the other 2. So that first transistor is soldered down, we'll move on to the second. It is the same idea. We'll grab the transistor, make sure we have it oriented in the right direction. In this case it's upside down, so I gotta knock it around, move it back to the front, just like that. Hold on to it, and I'm gonna solder it down. Just like so. And now I'll add solder to the other two legs. There we go. Just like that, we have our transistors soldered in place. Just like that. And with that, we've got all of our components on the back soldered down. We will leave the battery bracket as our last component since it is the largest. We're now going to focus on the front. Keep in mind, LEDs are directional, all diodes in that matter. And so we had to mark which direction each of them go. Now being that we've got a nice artsy silk screen on here, the symbol of the ohm, we can't really read the indicator, which is a small bracket around each of the pads. We can't read that indicator because our silk screen gets in the way. So a design strategy that was used was to have a small indication on the silk screen. I've got the marking there. It may not show up in the video as well as I would hope, but in person it is quite clear. It'll show the direction of the diode. All of these pads are in the same direction, so all the diodes are going to be going to the left. So keep that in mind when soldering it on. And now on the diodes, I should note, on the diodes there will be a green arrow to indicate which direction. So you can see this green arrow here is pointing in the left direction. When we rotate this around, we're going to want to make sure that green arrow is still pointing in this direction, so I'm just going to flip it, place it down, and this is the direction that we want the LED to be in. On the LED, you can't see it in the video, but on the LED there will be very, very tiny green dots inside the LED to also indicate the direction. So we'll make sure to utilize that indicator as well. When soldering these on, I should also note that time does matter. So we don't want to hold the soldering iron down too long. I would say about 1 to 2 seconds is good enough. And if the solder isn't flowing, I would suggest adding a bit more flux. Doesn't hurt to do 3 seconds, but at that point there is no guarantee that the component will work. So just like the resistors, I'm going to add solder to one of the two pads for each of the components, and then I will solder them down just as I did the resistors. I've got one of each of the pads soldered down, and I'm just going to put a bit of flux on each of these, just so that the connections are clean. Starting with the first LED, which I've placed down. I'm going to grab it, solder one pad down, make sure it's got a strong connection, and then I'm going to go in and solder the other pad. Just like that. It doesn't require much heat or time. And just like that, we've got our first LED soldered down. And we do that with every other LED, so I will zip through all of these. And just like that, all of the LEDs are soldered on. So now, last, we have our battery connector. I'm going to first add a little bit of solder to the center pad here, since it'll kind of give it a little bit of a protrusion so it touches the battery. So there's always a connection. Doesn't need to be much, just a small little blip, just to give it a nice pad for the battery to touch. And now this is where we're going to use the solder flux, or solder paste, I mean. Solder paste is just solder, little solder balls floating around in some flux. So you do not need flux when you use this, as it is primarily made of flux. And we're going to squeeze some out onto the pads, just like that. Let it stick down. Put that to the side, and then we're going to grab our battery bracket, and I'm just going to use the tweezers to line it up and place it down onto the solder paste. Just like that, we can line it up onto the pads. And with that lined up, we can just solder down one pad first. So I'm just going to heat it up and get a bit of solder to go and flow. Just like that. I don't need to fully have it flow as long as it holds it down, so I can solder the other side fully. And maybe even add a little bit of solder to the mix. Make sure there's a strong connection. Hold it down a little bit, let it flow. It is a large part, so we need to make sure it heats up fully. I'm just going to go back to this pad over here. Make sure this guy is soldered down correctly. Give it some heat for the solder to flow. And with that, the battery connector is now soldered in place. So now we can test the board. Of course, gotta wait for this to cool down a little bit, since we did give it a lot of heat. And in this time, we can look over, make sure no one made any mistakes. You could ask a friend to look over it. And when it looks good, you can then put the battery in and watch it work. Just like that. It's blinking. Give it a little bit of shade and you can see. And of course, since this is a badge, we'll want to include the pin. So you can throw the pin in through that hole at the top, and just like that, it can now become a pin. Or you could have it without the pin if you are wanting that as well. Thanks for watching, and I wish you luck in soldering on the components.